Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina. I'm a volunteer on the SHRM Programming Committee. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled The Kaepernick Effect, the Next Chapter in Brand-Sponsored Content. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them via the question box of the GoToWebinar panel, and we will read them aloud to the speaker at the end of the webinar. We also want to remind you that you are eligible to receive one business HRCI credit and one SHRM professional development credit for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a survey link. The survey must be completed for you to receive the certificate for your credit. Once the survey has been completed, the credit forms will be emailed to you within 1 week. All slides will be sent to all attendees after the webinar. Today's webinar will feature Chris Blake, Executive Director at 215 Creative. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, hey everybody, this is Chris Blake, and as mentioned, this is going to be a presentation on what's titled the Kaepernick Effect. And when we talk about that idea of the next chapter in brand-sponsored content, there's a lot already baked into that title. You know, the next chapter in brand-sponsored content. Even the word branding can be very loaded for a lot of people, and we'll get into all of this and we'll unpack it piece by piece. So as we kind of go through today, just a reminder that if you do have questions, there will be an opportunity to type those in as we go. And then also we'll prompt it again at the end. If anyone has questions, we can enter them in at the end and then we can have some dialogue back and forth. Michelle, I just wanted to make sure I didn't jump the gun there. Are we good to jump in?
Yes.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure there wasn't another formal item on the questioning. But all right, great. So as mentioned by Elena, I am an Executive Creative Director at 215 Creative. It's a Philadelphia-based ad agency. And just a little bit of context on myself, because I think that always helps have an understanding of, you know, where that point of view is coming from in the discussion. Obviously, a lot of the topic here is very tied to marketing, but I think there's, as you'll see, and as was listed in the updated description, there's a lot of overlap in this subject matter when it relates to marketing and how it overlaps with values of an organization. And, you know, it kind of prompts us to ask questions about how defined our values are as organizations, and then ultimately what those lead to. So a little bit about me. I started out in marketing in a number of different capacities. I worked for a microbrewery, and then I worked for about a decade actually at a financial institution, a credit union here in town that's now goes by the name of Ardent Credit Union, and got a little bit of taste of kind of cause marketing, even at the credit union level, because they do have, you know, a foundation in that idea that they were trying to offer a better option comparatively to banks and their whole origination. So got a little bit of a start and kind of a window into that back in those days. And then ultimately I went to ad school up in New York, broke into advertising as a copywriter. So I'm very much on the copywriting side as I came through the ranks in actually working in advertising. I like to say I'm a failed designer, though. I initially tried to get in as a designer. And that's helped me, you know, through my career kind of as I got going. Here's a list of some of the clients that I've had the chance to work on over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I say that helped me a lot because in retrospect, you know, as I got better at copywriting and in working things out, I also had, you know, the wherewithal to talk about the visuals and things like that in the bigger picture. Actually went to get my MBA rather soon out of undergrad. So I had more of a strategy background, more of a business background, more of a management background too. That, again, something that didn't help me initially, but then in some interesting ways has helped pay off in the longer run with a lot of clients. When we look at that and the idea of, you know, these things, advertising and branding, I think that's something also that's just worth noting before we jump in. It's going to come up throughout the topic, but initially the last agency I was at, I had gone to ad school, as I mentioned, up in New York, and I really honed the ability to make advertisements, campaigns, short-term campaignable ideas, whether they be to promote a promotion for a product that's more sales oriented in its goals, or a brand, or also on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes we'd get into projects that were more about raising brand awareness. So from the marketing side of things, I really honed the campaign work. But when I started out at a former agency that I worked at, they did a lot of branding work. And that was a completely different kind of muscle to exercise, so to speak, in thinking. And that was much more reliant on getting to really know what made an organization tick, really getting to know its people at the top level, but then also kind of more at the day-to-day level of the people that are interacting with the customers, the consumers, the people that manufacture the products. Because ultimately what a brand should be and should reflect are those organizational values and the stance that a company or organization kind of has on everything, all things. But a lot of times that word branding is associated with what you see here on this page, the logo or a color. In the case of Coca-Cola, it's famously also the shape of the bottle and the feel of that bottle. But really getting into things there gave me and provided me a big window into the idea that branding is much more than all those things. It's actually everything. It's every touch point that a consumer or a prospect would have with your company. So it's anytime someone picks up the phone to call Nike's customer service, that's branding. How you answer that call, how you send your products out, how they're delivered, how your return policy works. So getting that window, I think, is going to be applicable today in the topics that we talk about, because that's really where we get into the overlap between what we believe in as organizations and then also how that guides how we operate, both from an HR standpoint, but also from a marketing standpoint. So without further ado, back to the topic at hand, the Kaepernick effect. So where did this all start, and where did the title even come from? I'm sure a lot of the folks here are familiar, but back in 2016, not that long ago, but in some ways very long ago, as you can imagine, the election was kind of up in full swing. That idea of the politics and the political applications of it, were the presidential race and all that were at hand. But in a otherwise meaningless preseason game of the NFL, Colin Kaepernick, there on the right, he decided that he was going to use his platform as an athlete to make a statement. And at the time, if you remember back to that summer preceding that August 26th date, there was a lot of police shootings of minorities and people of color, and seemingly there wasn't a whole lot of reaction. And there were these cases that happened over that summer that just kind of kept popping up, kept getting notoriety. There was a momentum building to them. But then there was also, there wasn't a whole lot of reaction, seemingly from the authorities, so to speak. So when Colin Kaepernick came out and felt strongly about this issue, he used his platform, to try to stand up for the idea of, ideas and values of racial injustice, police brutality, and kind of make a stance on that by kneeling down ultimately. After the game, he was quoted as saying that he wasn't looking for anyone's approval, that he just wanted to stand up for people who were being oppressed. And ironically, he did that by kneeling down. So this instantly caught fire. A lot of people saw it as disrespectful to the American flag. Layered on top of that, the military got brought into it, the angle that it was disrespectful to the military. Was another touch point that flared a lot of rage for people. And then on the proponent side, people that saw this as an expression of free speech, a lot of people saw it as a very respectful form of protest. The dignity of kneeling down, it wasn't like he turned his back or did any other kind of physical gestures that would be considered even more egregious. The idea that he knelt was kind of considered to be a very respectful form of protest on the proponent side. So when we look at these issues and the reaction, probably more importantly, it mirrored what the climate was in society. So that zeitgeist was really kind of tapped into with this small but really meaningful gesture. And then when we also take a step back and we layer in some other business decisions, as you saw on the logo slide, I had the opportunity over the last 6 years. I worked with the Philadelphia Eagles here locally in the Philadelphia market, and that was a great opportunity. They were a great client. There are a lot of good people on their side, and getting to know them and, just how the NFL works in general a little bit, having had the opportunity to work on the NFL draft, not this last year, but the year preceding, the identity there and the branding for that. These are businesses. They have business considerations, and there were a number of pressures on the NFL leading into the season. So even preceding this protest, TV ratings were taking a dip. So that's a major revenue for funds or funnel for revenue, I should say. And that was already something they were feeling the stress on and the heat on. Their TV ratings were slipping. That was also seen in some other reactions by the NFL. They were really clamping down on how they wanted to allow teams to broadcast highlights on social media channels. So the NFL was seeing a change. They didn't quite know what was causing it. Part of their reaction was to inhibit the sharing of their highlights on social media. They were trying to find any way they could to sustain and grow their TV ratings. When this hit, that was already happening, and it got brought into discussion. So talking heads started to associate the failing TV ratings, with issues like this one. There's other incidents as well that were, considerably more egregious, domestic violence with players, things like that. So it was all wrapped up in the conversation about, why the NFL was taking a dip. On the other side, you had a person wrapped up in this. Colin Kaepernick is, his career, at the time he made this protest, he was a backup. So he had some really early success in his career. He actually led the 49ers, I believe, in the second season to the Super Bowl. So the biggest game of the year for those that aren't familiar with an NFL. He was playing in it, and that was, unprecedented, really. I mean, very few quarterbacks have done that. Quarterback's the most important position in sports, arguably, and to achieve that success so early in his career was a great success. He then fell on harder times, wasn't playing that great. By this point, he was the backup in a very needy league for that position, the quarterback position, and as mentioned, arguably the most important position in sports. There's oftentimes kind of a shuffling of the deck. Somebody that had some success elsewhere oftentimes will then go become a backup at another team. So after this season, in which he did his kneeling during the games, he actually opted to enter free agency. He forewent his fifth year of his contract that he had the option to take or let go. He chose to enter free agency. And then as it's gotten some notoriety, he was never signed by any other team. So 31 other teams passed on him for the next few seasons, even up until today. And that's in and of itself kind of part of the story. The idea that the NFL more or less looks to have shunned him, blackballed him, whatever we want to call it. He has blacklisted. He's not on a roster today, and he's arguably much more capable than many other players. So that actually became a lawsuit, and that kind of ran its course over the last few years. So that's a little bit about the person, a little bit about the employer, so to speak, and if we consider the NFL the employer. But then there's another organization that obviously got involved in retrospect. There were a lot of people that were on his side. The with Cap hashtag kind of broke out right after the protest. And then Nike, with a lot of notoriety, made him the voice of one of their annual campaigns this past year. So when they partnered with Colin Kaepernick to be the voice of a campaign, that sponsorship of an athlete that was controversial, that took a controversial stance, was a big news story in and of itself. It was launched with a video on TV and throughout social media. The closing line was that idea of believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. At this point, he'd been out of the NFL a number of years. and his career essentially was tanked by this kneeling, arguably. And that line had a lot of relevance given the trajectory of his career and what led to it. That he was believing in this cause, he thought it was worthwhile, and he continued to do it in the face of it not being popular. And so when that ad launched and it had that ending delivered by him, which the reveal of that commercial is that he was the one doing the voiceover all along in the video, it had a level of authenticity and it had more weight to it because his story was the message. So this was met, as you could imagine, with a lot of, and I'm probably stating the obvious. I'm sure a lot of people already know all this about the Kaepernick effect, but I just wanted to touch on it since it is the main point and the main title of the topic, in case anyone doesn't have the background. When this happened, it rekindled a lot of the fires on both sides. A lot of people looked at it and they saw the tactics that the NFL was suffering from already, the idea that they had kneeling protests, that their TV rankings were failing and faltering. They saw anyone that lined up with these controversial figures, a lot of the talking heads and kind of critics, they even the proponents, a lot of people doubted that this would be successful right when it launched. They thought that this was going to be a recipe for failure. And then the numbers that played out over the next month or so actually painted a completely different picture. In that month that this launched, there was $6 billion increase in sales. When you hear a number like that, though, for a company as big as Nike, I don't really think it gives you any sense for what that really meant. So I think percentages oftentimes are a much better indicator there. And when we put that in percentage terms, it's a 61% spike, specifically for the merchandise sales. So arguably from a business side of things, very successful in the short run at least. And that idea, that you could line up with a controversial figure and make a stance, that it could be successful. At the time, some people had failed to do that. If you remember some other examples where, and we'll get into these in more depth, but the Kendall Jenner with Pepsi kind of sponsorship and the commercial there that got pulled within a day of being run. There are other instances where you would seemingly have success if you spoke about the controversial topic, but it failed, and oftentimes it comes down to execution. So what made the execution of the Nike campaign successful? Well, at a very base level, the first thing that we kind of look at is the audience. Nike's core audience it tends to be younger and it tends to be diverse. It's not to say they don't have older, white military kind of people that were on the other side of the issue as customers, but they do have, their key demographic, who is their customer, lined up with the key demographics that were the people that were looking at Colin Kaepernick as a favorable figure. So from the very base level of how audiences lined up, their audience lined up with the audience that was favorable of Colin Kaepernick. At the same time, you could say the same thing about Pepsi in a lot of ways, but Pepsi's effort failed miserably. So it's not just a factor of audience. There's a lot of other things that come into it. So part of this presentation will really unpack some of those things. And when we look into these topics, the topic of social and cause marketing, it's very complex. It's interesting. There's a lot of layers to it. It really gets at marketing at its core. And I think that's where, this is ultimately to talk about how it applies to organizations. But that idea of marketing being related to these issues, you could tackle a lot of different projects by understanding the dynamic that made the Colin Kaepernick effort successful. So as we step through that a little bit more in detail, we're used to commercial overlapping with art. Commercial art has been around for a long time. Only in the last few decades has really, the social component come in. We're going to talk about some historical examples of that, where it would overlap. It's not like this just started in the last few years. It's been decades that this has happened, but it is definitely increasing in its frequency. And that center of that diagram is really where we're talking about the center of, things coming together from a commerce side, from an art side, and from a social side. So you can see, with the exception of maybe art, but also just like whatever we want to consider that other third component. But the idea of the overlap between social and commerce is very much where the HR world lies. When we think about this term, cause marketing has been around for a while. It's co-opting a cause for the purposes of marketing. So what are ways you can do that? Well, you can really lean into the cause itself, or you can lean into the marketing. So there is a spectrum of how this operates. Cause marketing can be much more of a sales tool on the marketing side, and it can be much more of a causal kind of social effort that has light sprinklings of a business on it. So on this spectrum, we're going to walk through a few examples here. Campbell's Soup is one that in the earlier 2000s, mid 2000s, really started to get some traction in honor of breast cancer awareness, as we've seen in a number of different industries, the NFL included. In the month of October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month, Campbell's started rolling out a custom package for that month that would signify to the customer that some of the proceeds from the sale of that can, those cans marked pink with the pink ribbon, would lead to donations for that cause. So when we take a look at that, that's a very simple way of associating a cause and supporting a cause that pretty much no one's against. I don't think I've ever heard anyone against breast cancer awareness, but it doesn't have to be controversial, I guess is my point here. It's the idea that you can co-opt a cause and bring it in and fold it in with your marketing. I think most people would look at this and say that's great. Again, no one would argue against supporting something like breast cancer awareness. This has been very successful for Campbell's. I don't have very recent numbers, but even in the early years that it was operating, to give some perspective, in one grocer, one store in particular, one chain of stores, just to give an idea of how successful it was, on a typical month in, month out, the red canned label, the traditional label that Andy Warhol painted over and over again, that can of soup that we all know and love, that sells at a rate of about 3.5 million cans per month. So when the month of October hits, though, and the pink label was put on with the pink ribbon, the sales of those soup cans would go up to 7 million. So, actually seeing a doubling of your sales in the month that this happens is obviously an impact. So from a marketing standpoint, this is a positive for the business. And that's where it starts to get into a little bit of a cringy kind of part of the topic, and the idea that companies are making money off of these called marketing tactics. When we think about Campbell's and how they were positioning this, it's positioned as a fundraiser really to the layperson. They were actually donating, I think at the time, they made their public statement that they would donate $250,000. When you do the math, that breaks out to pennies on the can. And as you can see, if you double your sales, there's going to be more profit there. So again, no one would argue against the benefit of this, but there is also a business side to it. So we can think of some other examples. Even when we think of the pink breast cancer awareness, the NFL is taken over by that, and it's become even kind of the month for giving back. The NFL, even outside of just breast cancer awareness, it's already started to do some other efforts. Having worked with the Eagles in the past few years, a new thing that's popped up in the month of October is what's called My Cause, My Cleats, where players actually kind of sponsor their own causes by wearing cleats that are decked out with a specific charity or specific issue at hand. To raise awareness there. But ultimately, you can't avoid it if you watch an NFL game in the month of October. everyone's wearing something pink, and that's great. It's really good to see. But there also, again, is a business side to it. You go out to the youth fields all across the country for youth basketball, youth football. X number of kids are wearing a pink chin strap, pink cleats, because they're seeing and trying to mimic what those professional athletes are doing. So this has been a tactic that's been applied. It's got a good feel to it, but there is also a business side to it. And I think the cause marketing is probably the most, if we go back to that spectrum, it's probably the most on the marketing side of things. But when we start to think about, pushing out into the cause territory, there's some other examples that kind of push there. For a moment, though, I just want to touch on the difference between marketing and branding. That word branding, when we talked about how it's more than a logo, it's really just any touch point that your brand has with anybody in any kind of way. It's really the combination of perceptions that a brand has. It's the persona. It's that idea of how you're perceived by potential partner, prospect, employee, customer. When we think about that, it also starts to guide how the business can work and operate. So some other examples of cause marketing that are more on the cause side of things: Tom's Shoes. This is actually baked into the Tom Shoes business plan. For every pair of shoes that they sell, of shoes to an actual customer, there's a pair that get donated to kids in need, oftentimes in third world countries. So the owner, Blake Mayoski, his name's actually not Tom. He started the company with this kind of baked into how they operate, and that component of the company is a huge reason for its success. It's just baked right in. So that's more, it's definitely a marketing tactic, but it's baked into the organization. When we think more on the cause side of things, Dove Real Beauty, for anyone that remembers that campaign, it was launched with a video that saw a fairly normal looking woman that we can all relate to coming into a chair, sitting down, looking a little bit sheepish, not very made up. And then progressively lights go on, a makeup artist comes in, makeup starts getting applied, lighting gets shifted, the makeup gets done up more and more. After her hair gets blown back, photos are taken. Then we take her photo. The woman goes home. We take the photo into Photoshop. The video goes through a number of steps here where her jaw, her jawline are given more depth, shadow. Her jawline's actually narrowed to make her look thinner. Contours are added to her cheekbones. Her eyes are enhanced. The coloring, her nose, everything gets edited. And this is not the reality of who she is. And, we see that before and after again. Someone we'd recognize as looking normal to someone that looks like a high glam model. And the video ended with the idea of her up on a billboard. And then this stance that if all we're ever seeing reflected in advertising is this glamorous, fake version of beauty, there's no wonder that we all feel bad about how we look. And, the idea of celebrating real beauty is what Dove stood for. So that idea is what they wanted to take a stance on. And Dove Real Beauty became the campaign. We see beauty all around us. That launched with that video, a number of videos that were kind of used to kind of position that and message it, along with billboards that celebrated the idea of real beauty all around us. And Dove became the voice for that. So that was a cause that they more or less made. That was, started with a campaign, and it became kind of a stance that they made on their own because they saw a need for it. So it's a marketing campaign kind of becoming its own cause. So when we get into cause and values branding, there's some other examples. They need to be built on the values of an organization. And I think that's the most important thing to take away, that it really needs to start with the organization and its values. It's got to be real. When we think of another example there, Patagonia. So the founder and CEO of Patagonia is, I'm going to butcher his name. I've got his book, but Yvon Chouinard. He is an interesting guy. He's an outdoorsman. He's a surfer. He's a kayaker, falconer, and fly fisher. And his parents were an eclectic mix. His dad was kind of a manufacturer of things and kind of a tinker, and he picked that up and he started an outdoors brand out in California called Patagonia. And they're famous for a number of reasons that are all values-based. Their products, he believes in standing behind the products that they make as a company. They famously had a really strong return policy that you could always return your products, and they would repair them and or replace them at value for a customer. So that idea of standing behind your values, it also guides policies, not just return policies. So as we mentioned, he is an avid surfer, and Patagonia is famous for their surf policy that when, and I quote, "When the surf comes up, you drop work and you go surfing." So the company itself has that as a codified rule that they live by, and that's evidenced by their actual CEO and founder living up to it. So when you see that kind of a commitment to a value put into place and enact it, that says a lot, and that ripples through an organization that they back up what they believe in. It's not just lip service. So we'll get to this at the end, but what are those policies, that your company has, or what are those values that your company has, and how are we actively signaling that to our employees, and also outwardly, Patagonia, for as much as they signal that to their employees, they're also well known for it outwardly as a brand, that they are who they say they are, that they practice their values in action. So that makes them a more appealing company for people that go to buy their wetsuit or their sweaters or whatever the product is, because they feel better about this company that backs up what it says it'll do. So when we think back to that idea of the integrity, coming back to that return policy, when a company operates like this with its own employees, we can believe it more on the greedy side for us, that they'll honor their commitment of a return policy. It's also led to other decisions. Also mentioned that he's an avid fly fisher. So when issues come up about environmental concerns, he's going to take a stance. The company's going to take a stance. They have a strong value system. So here, protesting dams in Patagonia, that would obviously impact the environment. I'm not an expert on how and why, but they have a point of view and they back it up, and it leads to guiding all of those decisions. So when you see that rippled through your organization, I think that's when values are really expressed in the greatest way they can be, and you get the most value out of them. Ben & Jerry's is another famous example for a number of reasons. The founders of Ben & Jerry's, when they started out, they had some different notions on what an ice cream brand could even be. The idea that it could be a high-end kind of product was something a little novel, but they were also outside of the box on a number of things like pay scale. For different reasons, they had a point of view that lower level employees, so to speak, on the pay scale shouldn't be taken advantage of. So even at the highest ranks, initially when they launched, they had an equitable pay policy that they had a 5-to-1 rule, where the highest salary couldn't be any more than 5 times the lowest salaried employee at their company. So these egregious kind of shifts between a CEO and the lowest level employee on the pay scale, they didn't want to have that exist at their company. Over the years, that number shifted, the ratio shifted a little bit slightly, but the principle still applies. Other policies too kind of make them stand out in how they source their ingredients. So it's not just that a company has a value and it applies in one way. I think Patagonia is a great example of that. Ben & Jerry's is another great example of that. What their values are and what they look for in partnerships is reflected with this partnership that they have with the Greystone Bakery up in New York City. This is a company that makes the brownies for Ben & Jerry's, as well as just other products that they make themselves. It's a company that has a very pro stance on second chances for felons. And they hire people that have prison records, and they actually look at them as very loyal employees, because all too many times these people don't have opportunities to go out and get a job. So there's actually, they kind of see it as a way to get really motivated employees that society's kind of neglecting. So from a business side, there's a greedy side to it. I use greedy kind of tongue in cheek. There's something in it for the company. There's something in it from a societal standpoint and from making good and doing good. And then Ben & Jerry's, along with getting good brownies, is also helping to support a cause they believe in. So these stances that we take and we value, there's any number of ways they can express themselves. And for the record, there's also, when you use that term, do good, there's a set of brownies that they make. I believe they're called the Do Goodies, that they sell themselves out of their own bakery. And then we think of companies like Apple. So in more recent times, we all know Apple is a great tech company. A lot of great innovations come out of the company. But in recent years, their stance against the FBI having access to someone's phone, even though, a crime was seeming, someone obviously committed, Apple took a hard stance on privacy. And for all of their noteworthy marketing that they get from their product launches, their Apple Talks, this stance is something that, in the perceptions of consumers, says so much to anyone that goes to consider buying a phone or a product from Apple, because it lines up with, again, their values and what they value and how those are reflected in their actions, that even in a tough time or a tough situation, they're going to stick to their guns and stick to their values. And then we get into social marketing. So we talk about co-opting a cause for marketing. Social marketing, obviously, social media is now a thing, so social can kind of be confused in some ways. What I'm really using it here to talk about is the idea of a societal issue or societal moment. So there are causes. We looked back at how Dove Real Beauty is kind of making a cause. But really what I'm talking about here and what we're going to look at are social moments and movements. So think about the NBA. Unfortunately, another shooting, another way that an athlete voiced concern for and support for police brutality, speaking out against it, speaking out against police brutality. A number of NBA players came out with this simple T-shirt, "I can't breathe," harkening back to the incident up in New York, where a gentleman was choked to death, when he was being brought under control by a police officer. The NBA treated this completely differently than the NFL. And I think this is a good case in point and that's why I put it under NBA. This is something that was very organic from the players' point of view. It was a number of teams, a number of players. It started, I think, even with teams up in New York City that did it. And then it was, spread out across the NBA with a number of notable stars wearing the T-shirt in solidarity. And it wasn't fined, it wasn't squashed to the same extent that the kneeling was in the NFL. It was something that more or less kind of took its natural course, and the position was taken and made. ESPN's another example where politics have been even more divisive in recent years. President Trump getting into Twitter battles with athletes, notably LeBron James, that spurred the idea that he's more than an athlete, that he actually takes stances on things and gives back to his community. And it's not just his role to just play basketball. He's a person. He's complex, just like anybody else. ESPN backed that up, and actually that movement and that social kind of moment, they made a 7-part series out of it. He did a tour over the one off season, and kind of wove that into some of the other work he does from a social cause and charity standpoint. So next, we want to get into that's just a little bit about like the different kind of components of social cause marketing. And then also wanted to look at some case studies. And in doing that, wanted to consider, what makes them good and bad. But initially, even kind of looking at that, good and bad don't really position it the right way. It's really what's effective and not effective, because even if it makes you feel something negative, it might be effective. Because a number of these issues, going back to the first one that kicked off the whole presentation, the Kaepernick stance and Nike's endorsement of Colin Kaepernick could be, something that hits you in a positive way. It could be something that hits you in a negative way, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. So I think that's where, when we look at these things, the Colin Kaepernick and the Nike endorsement of his stance and his story, it was ultimately successful. And if you want to be very kind of dry bones about it, the sales went up, if we want to look at it that way. But the numbers speak to it being effective. Whether you like it or not is a different story, but it could make you feel good or bad, but it's effective. When we look at not effective, we look at things like the Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad that, again, arguably was the same territory that the Colin Kaepernick sponsorship was trending on, from a stirring the pot and organizational kind of standpoint, with a company like Pepsi getting involved with. They have a younger, diverse demographic that they're trying to appeal to. But some things that made it fall flat, again, just the result there, when we say not effective, this was pulled within 24 hours, so it didn't even last a day, because it was lampooned, and it was just, society had enormous tissue rejection to this advertisement. And I think there's a number of reasons. If we kind of look at them as one-to-one case studies, the thing that stands out about the Kendall Jenner endorsement, and kind of her weighing in, so to speak, as the symbol for a social statement, is that it felt very manufactured. Her story is not one of oppression, and she doesn't really have that story that backs up the stance they were trying to make. The way it was executed was very obviously kind of bubblegum and trying to kind of gloss over things. And the execution just did not feel authentic at all. So it really hit people the wrong way for those reasons, as well as some others. But when we think about it in contrast to the Colin Kaepernick example, Colin Kaepernick is biracial from an ethnicity standpoint, but then also he was adopted by a white family and raised in that quote unquote white household. So he kind of straddles both sides of the demographic story. He lives in both worlds. He also had the story to back up the statement. When we think about that idea that believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything, that was his story over the trajectory of his kneeling, and then ultimately his not earning a job in the NFL in the future years. So he did sacrifice his career for believing in something. I'm just going to take 1 second to take a drink. And when the story lines up with the message, and very literally they made him the voice of the campaign, that's when it works. Sometimes it's effective and not effective at the same time. Gillette, the stance they took on how we should be bringing up young boys in the moment of the Me Too movement, that people liked it and other people just really rejected it. I think when we kind of look at that, it's kind of like the jury's out, so to speak. A lot of people, and me included, I felt like the execution was poor. Could have been a lot better. It felt inauthentic to me, but I do also know other people that looked at that and thought it was a really positive statement. And I think that it's kind of an interesting one, because you get a mixed bag. It's not very cut and dry on exactly who disagrees with it and who agrees with it. It's a mixed bag. And I think that's where the execution was muddied for a lot of people. But this one was kind of a blue dress, white dress kind of reaction. Another company is Chick-fil-A. When we think about Chick-fil-A and how you can be both effective and ineffective, I think this is another one where a company that leads with its values, the idea that they're very kind of religious in their value system, closed on Sundays famously, but also they're the more kind of conservative views on equal rights as far as marriage and things like that. That's very divisive for a lot of people. And you could argue it's ineffective, and you could argue that it's effective. I think that's where it gets into the idea of it's probably ultimately effective because it's helping to support the causes and the values that they have, but it's not to say that it's not alienating some people. Famously, Chick-fil-A, closed on Sundays, even when it's in an NFL stadium where most of the games are played on Sundays. Thought that was funny, like looking through this stuff. But the idea of having your values, and holding them even when it's hard. Arguably, Sunday would be a huge day of sales for them, but they've refused to shift from that. So the idea of these tactics, they're really shifting in their use. They're increasing in their use. So why? Well, there's the rise of the millennial audience. Every time a creative brief gets made, one of the first things you look for in advertising is, who am I talking to? Who is the voice, or who's the target, rather, of this piece of messaging? And you want to understand that because it can change the context of how you're going to deliver that message or how it should be delivered in the first place. Well, I'd say 9 times out of 10, every brief that comes across our desk now is targeting the millennial, and specifically the female millennial, for a number of reasons, because they drive sales the most. So that tends to be the primary audience. The millennial, quote unquote, demographic has a higher social awareness level, is associated with them. Generally speaking, they're next. That idea of being next and up and coming, they're going to be the new prime target audience for household income, all those things. So people want to get in on that early because, when we consider the lifetime value of a customer, that's a customer that you want to win over. So this is, this increased awareness of social issues is driving a lot of these tactics, as well as social media. This is all very complex to pull it off because life is complex, and meaning is very layered. So you look at the Colin Kaepernick example, and things aren't simple, and they don't fit into a little box. And that's really just reflecting that life isn't typically cut and dry, black and white. One story that's always stuck with me, I had the opportunity in high school to be a volunteer on the school board. It was a very boring opportunity, but it was very enriching. One of the meetings, one night, there was a meeting about protesting busing of kids from one section of the school district to another section to increase equilibrium and our racial kind of diversity among schools. And you hear about busing, and you hear about desegregation of schools. And I went to school around Philadelphia. I didn't go to school in the deep South or anything like that. And this was in the 90s. It wasn't like back when this was actually like a touch point of starting to happen. But I remember just kind of having the assumption that, this is a good thing. But then you saw parent after parent from both sides state their arguments in the school board meeting, and you really got that sense that these issues are all complex. There's different sides and different takes on everything, and there's an argument to be had on issues when you actually open up and listen to them from both sides. So oftentimes it's not just cut and dry, but that's something that you already knew. We all know that. None of this is new, in fact. So when we talk about that and how this impacts us as an organization and also in marketing, it comes back to human nature, and human nature doesn't really change. That's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. So what are some historical campaigns? As I noted in the upfront, this wasn't something that just started in the last 5 to 10 years. There's a couple examples. Pepsi, when they got it right, back with really segmenting their marketing, the Pepsi generation. The Pepsi generation started with a campaign that targeted when they got the brief, that ad agency got the brief, it said target the baby boomers. So generations ago, we're now rippling out. It's now the millennials. But Pepsi generation was the millennials of their time. It was, the baby boomers are the prime audience that this was speaking to. So Pepsi created an entire campaign that labeled their product as the answer for the entire generation that was up and coming. It was a hugely successful campaign and effort, and then it guided marketing efforts for them over decades. Every few years, they would just upgrade the artist or the sponsor, so to speak, to appeal to that next younger up and coming generation for that lifetime valued customer they're trying to win over. Another campaign in advertising that gets a lot of credit as being the first, if not one of the first, that really hit on sensitive topics of cultural and racial identity is for Levy's Jewish Rye Bread. This campaign was created by DDB, a very noteworthy advertising agency, and it was a simple piece of communication. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's, real Jewish rye. Every ad said the same thing, and every ad featured someone that, stereotypically you look at it, not a Jewish kid, but very happy, very personable. And then they just rotated that through a number of ethnicities and looks. The quote unquote Irish cop was one of the first ads that went out, along with the choir, or the altar boy, and then also I think this Native American was also one of the first three that ran out. So these went up all around New York City, and it was a hit instantly. It's interesting looking at this now. If this were to run now, I wonder how it would be perceived. But at the time, it was heralded as great communication. Even people like Malcolm X here love these ads. The idea of these ads kind of coming out and celebrating our commonality at a time in the 60s where everything was very divisive really stood out against the grain, so to speak, and it was held up. So, playing on these topics and co-opting these things, it's not new. It's going to continue in its use, but it does boil down to effective execution. We think about authenticity. It's got to be you. It's got to be real. And really, lastly, circling this point, it's got to be easy when it's hard. Kind of joking with the Chick-fil-A remaining closed in NFL Stadium during a Sunday, but in all seriousness, like even in more harder times when Nike comes under fire for sponsoring an athlete like Colin Kaepernick, those hard decisions, quote unquote hard decisions, they should be easy if your values are really strong. And execution is key. So just to summarize that, audiences are skeptical for good reason. The millennial audience is always kind of associated with being even more skeptical than most, because ever since they've been alive and had their eyes open, they've been marketed to constantly. Whenever these are tried to pull off, the marketing shouldn't lead. I think Pepsi is a good example where it was very marketing heavy. The only asterisk I would kind of quote there is, you see the asterisk, and it's unless you're in Tom Shoes. So Tom Shoes company, when your marketing literally is the cause, and it's the idea of a program that you have of selling a product to, have some social good, I think that's where, the exception to that rule. And then creators should understand the point of view. So Beyonce recently signed on a sponsorship with Adidas, and I forget what other competitor agency, or I think it was the agency the shoe company that came to pitch her. Famously, Adidas had someone of color, and not just someone, like a team that was representing people of color, diversity in the team. It wasn't just a group of white men that came in to pitch her. And I don't remember what the other company was. I think it was Reebok, but they had more or less an all white male team that came in to present to her, and immediately she just kind of shut it down. Like, I need to have someone that understands me. So I back that up a little bit from creators should reflect the point of view or the audience. I think it's more about understanding, because I don't think we want to be excluding anybody from any kind of role, but I think that is vital to pulling these things off. You have to understand the nuance and the perspective of the audience. And then lastly, I'll just hit these points before opening it up for discussion. A 360 strategy is going to be beneficial. When we think about media, if it's paid or free, it's going to be amplified when we do it the right way. Social can amplify the message. PR can amplify the exposure. But ultimately, it comes down to the last two. When we think about timing, it's not just what you say, it's when you say it. Having something controversial ready to go in response in a timely fashion will make it make more impact. So when you don't have to flinch and you don't have to second guess and you don't have to think about it, but you can just address an issue, whether that's, Patagonia having the protest against the dam in their region, or it's another decision that's being made, or it's a marketing decision. That quick reaction, because you're confident of your values, is important. And then delivery. It's not just what you say or how you say it. It's also who says it. And I think Colin Kaepernick's a great example of that. And then ultimately, just remember, as with our companies and organizations, the marketing is just one part. Nike had this great run with Colin Kaepernick. It started out with him with the video. They extended into a larger campaign. If you need a reason to dream, here's 11. The U.S. women's team for soccer. Serena, it's only a crazy dream until you do it. Celebrating her rise from Compton to Wimbledon, every other U.S. Open or major. They expanded the cartoon work with Anthony Davis, a number of other stars in the NFL, alternative sports, skateboarding, in the last year or so with other athletes that got drafted. It's only crazy to do it. It was great marketing. It's a campaign that continues to run. But then your product still has to hold up. Last year, famously, Nike had a shoe disaster. A notable star in college, Zion Williamson, had his shoe literally explode during a game, causing him to get minorly injured and have to exit that game. It all comes back to what we're actually doing as a company. And to kind of throw this in there as tongue in cheek, but all the marketing in the world won't erase the actual company's product or value. So with that, just want to open it up for discussion. A couple things to kind of guide that. We'll pop open the questions, but really thinking about where you stand from an organizational standpoint with values. Does your organization have a surfing policy? Like Patagonia, what would yours be? Some other thought provokers: are there any social issues your organization would back? If the answers for that are easy, that probably means you have some codified values. If the answers to that are a little hard, that means you might need to do some thinking, some soul searching, and have some meetings about that, and more strongly define those values. So I'll just go back to the discussion slide, and I'll pop open the placeholder if we have any questions.
Thank you, Chris.
And, Yep.
We will now open it up for questions. If you have a question for our speaker, please type them into the question box at this time.
So while some questions are getting typed out, I see two that are in there. I can start to address those, or if you guys would like me to wait, I could give a few more minutes.
We can give it just a little bit. Okay, Alina, you can close out the webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you again to Chris for taking the time to share this knowledge with us. Thank you to each of you for joining us on today's webinar. As a reminder, please look for the follow-up email with the link to the survey. Be sure to complete the survey in order to receive HRCI and SHRM credits. Need to take your career to the next level? Philly SHRM is offering a 12-week instructor-led SHRM certification exam prep course study group for only $800 this fall. Prices for Philly SHRM members. Non-member pricing also available. I say only 800 because the SHRM Learning System books are included. Books alone are typically $750 through SHRM if you go to the self-study route. Commit yourself to take the next step. Register by July 15th for the biggest savings. The link to register may be found at www.phillyshrm.org and under the Resources tab. Choose Career Resources. We encourage you to check out the Philly SHRM website for updates on all of our upcoming programs. On behalf of Philly SHRM, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.